In a world where justice, drama, and sometimes sheer absurdity take center stage, three distinct tales capture the unpredictability of human behavior. In Thief Messes with the Wrong Ranchers, Running from the Tree People, an ill-fated criminal learns that not all targets are defenseless, especially when he crosses paths with some vigilant ranchers. Meanwhile, Unruly Mother in Hotel doesn't go away peacefully. Can we get an adult here? Showcases a night of chaos where a mother's lack of restraint leaves hotel staff and law enforcement handling far more than just a guest complaint. Finally, Entitled Woman Turns Traffic Ticket into Felony highlights the spiral of one woman's defiance as a simple traffic stop quickly escalates into a spectacle of entitlement and reckless decisions. These stories reveal how unexpected situations can test character, often in surprising and humorous ways. 1. Thief Messes with the Wrong Ranchers. Running from the Tree People? At a small ranch in the sun-drenched west, a group of ranchers gathered under the fiery sunset, their faces etched with deep thought. A serious incident had just occurred, leaving them restless and anxious. The sudden crack of a gunshot shattered the evening's stillness, disturbing the peaceful atmosphere. Whispers rose as the group exchanged looks, their eyes subtly signaling alarm. Someone was sneaking around on their land. But what infuriated them even more was the appearance of an old man, a mysterious figure they had given the bizarre nickname, the Tree Man. Timestamp 000. "We can't let this Tree Man run rampant any longer," one rancher's voice rang out, deep and resolute, yet tinged with anger and concern. His eyes scanned the group, meeting nods of agreement. The flickering light of the oil lamp illuminated their faces, each person radiating a suppressed fury. "He might have a gun," he added, tightening his grip on his staff as if ready for a fight, "and he could be secretly looking for a way to shoot our cattle." The other ranchers, simple folk who were used to the land, nodded in unison, their faces marked with anxiety. A heavy sigh echoed from the back, and another man slammed his hand down on the table, the sound loud in the stillness. "We can't let this stranger waltz onto our land, especially not someone like him." Timestamp 0043. At that moment, a man in his 40s, small in stature but with sharp eyes, spoke up in a voice filled with suspicion and a hint of fear. "I saw an old man pass by here," he said, glancing nervously around as if fearing someone might overhear. His voice dropped to a whisper, forcing the group to lean in closer. "He looked like he came out of the woods, sneaky, something wasn't right." The group fell silent for a moment, the image of the strange old man forming in each of their minds as the man recounted what he saw. Another rancher muttered, "He doesn't seem like an ordinary person. Everything about him, it's just off." Everyone felt the unease from the story, seen in the worried looks and furrowed brows of the group. A deep sigh filled the room. No one spoke further, but all shared the same thought. The old man's appearance was a sign of something lurking, a shadow creeping through the peace of their land. Timestamp 1:18. As the group began to discuss seriously, the suspicion in everyone's minds grew stronger as they thought of the strange deaths of about 10 cattle they had found scattered across the ranch. The cattle, once a valuable asset to them, were now dead under mysterious circumstances with no clear cause. The sight of it had left many of them stunned and fearful. "Maybe someone's been shooting the cattle at night," one rancher asserted, his voice full of anger and doubt. He frowned, gripping his wooden staff tightly, the sharp edge of his frustration sweeping over the faces of those who agreed. It couldn't have been an accident. No one could shoot that many cattle without leaving a trace. His comment sparked even more fury in the others. One man added, "And the weirdest thing is, These cattle all died at night when no one was watching. The only trace left were tiny bullet holes, as if someone shot them from a distance, and no one saw or heard anything. The group fell silent, their faces full of worry. They exchanged glances, as if sharing an unspoken fear. "I don't know about you all, but I have a bad feeling. That tree man, he's definitely involved," one of them sighed. His eyes filled with concern, but also determination. They all understood that this was no ordinary cattle theft. Something far more dangerous could be lurking right on their land. Timestamp 222. After an intense debate, with no clear explanation for the cattle's strange deaths, the group decided they needed to act immediately. They couldn't sit idle while these incidents continued. The ranchers dispersed, heading into the areas surrounding the farm where they suspected the tree man might be hiding. One pointed toward a dense thicket nearby, where the fading twilight couldn't fully illuminate all the corners. "If he's hiding, there's got to be a place around here," he said, his voice full of doubt, but also urging the others to take action. They began to search step by step, every tiny clue under their watchful eyes. However, as they moved around the area, the trail seemed to grow fainter. No vehicles were found, no signs of movement or clear paths. Only hurried footprints, as though someone had passed through recently and then quickly vanished. Another rancher looked at the dense forest area, shaking his head and sighing. "He must be too familiar with this land. The way he hides, it's like he melts into the leaves." The group continued their search, but suddenly they felt as if some force was playing with them. They sifted through every bush, checked every crack, but couldn't find any more clear signs. It felt as though this old man was not just an ordinary person. He had become one with nature, blending into the environment, making everything around him seem blurred and elusive. They couldn't help but wonder if they were searching for a real tree man, or if they were just victims of paranoia, driven by the mysterious deaths of their cattle. Still, the silence and faint traces made them uneasy. It seemed like this forest had become the perfect hiding spot for someone like the tree man. Timestamp 338. When more ranchers and some police officers were called in for assistance, the atmosphere became tense but also charged with excitement. The group focused on checking every nook and cranny of the farm, carefully inspecting the fences and gates, leaving no spot where an intruder could slip through. They couldn't let anyone hide in the vast darkness of the land. Security posts were set up, but something still felt off, as if a shadow was lurking somewhere in the woods, watching every move they made. One person in the group, while searching around a corner of the fence, suddenly burst into laughter. His laughter somewhat eased the tense atmosphere. "Hey, if he really is the tree man, why don't we try calling him by name?" Another person, trying to lighten the mood, quickly joined in the joke. "How about calling him Handsome Pine Tree?" The whole group erupted in laughter, and for a moment the tension seemed to lift, as if the sound of laughter had helped dispel some of the suffocating anxiety. But behind the laughter, they still felt the seriousness of the situation, because they knew they couldn't overlook any signs anymore. None of them wanted to face the mysterious deaths of their cattle again, and they would not allow the tree man to continue his mischief. Timestamp 441. Suddenly, just as the silence fell over them again, a shadow appeared from behind a large tree. The whole group turned sharply, their hearts pounding in their chests. In that moment, everyone stopped breathing. Standing before them was the old man they had heard about for so long, the one they called the tree man. But his face was not calm at all. On the contrary, he looked extremely panicked, sweating profusely, and the stains on his old shirt were soaked. He stood there, his eyes wide with fear, looking around in confusion, as though the trees around him were watching and lurking, waiting for him to make a move. It felt as if the old man was being chased by an invisible threat, a fear he couldn't explain. I'm just trying to avoid the tree people, he stammered, his voice trembling, as if trying to reassure himself. His eyes kept darting around, glancing at the tall trees, as though waiting for something. The herders and police officers were taken aback by his words, none of them fully understanding what he was saying. But the atmosphere suddenly became strange and suffocating. They looked at each other, hesitating, unsure of how to confront him. In the old man's eyes, the fear was real, but his words didn't convince them. "What? What are you talking about?" a herder asked suspiciously, taking a step forward, trying to keep a safe distance. "Tree people? How could... What's going on?" He looked around, but saw nothing except the dense, silent trees. The sight sent a shiver down their spines. They weren't sure if they should believe him, but the old man's fearful, uncontrollable gaze made them all wonder if something truly existed, something hiding in the leaves, waiting to pounce. The old man kept looking around as if he was waiting for something terrible to happen. Suddenly, in a brief moment, he staggered back a step, his legs wobbling as though trying to avoid a dark shadow drawing near. His face was so panicked it was hard to imagine. The herders, though still skeptical, couldn't help but feel a strange sensation, as if something dangerous was indeed lurking somewhere around them. When he was discovered, James, the man they called the Tree Man, jumped up, his eyes wide with terror like a squirrel caught in the act. His silver hair was a mess, and his face was ashen, as if he had just encountered a terrible threat. The old man took a step back, hurriedly waving his hands as if trying to brush away some ghostly presence chasing him. "I don't mean to harm anyone," he shouted, his voice shaking and exhausted, his words coming out so quickly it seemed they wanted to vanish before they could be heard. "I just want to find shelter. The trees here are beautiful, and I like watching them." Although his voice was soft and naive, his eyes showed panic, as though he was trying to escape from an invisible enemy. No one spoke, but they all looked at him with suspicion. None of them believed his words, the dead cattle, the strange gunshots, and now this old man wandering in the woods. It all painted a bizarre picture. Timestamp 5:27. One herder, unable to contain his frustration, raised an eyebrow and asked again, his tone filled with doubt, "What? 3 people? Is that why you're here?" His sharp question cut through the suffocating atmosphere like a knife. James hesitated, scratching his head awkwardly. "I'm just a nature lover. I heard trees. They can talk, and I wanted to try it out." His answer was a jumble of incoherent words with no convincing reasoning behind it. The group slowly moved closer, their faces full of discomfort and suspicion. It seemed as though they were dealing with a madman, someone not only creating bizarre stories, but also trying to justify his actions. One herder frowned, his arms crossed in front of his chest, not believing a word he had just heard. James's story was becoming more absurd by the minute, making everyone around him feel more and more irritated. His naive lies only sparked anger and unease in their hearts. Timestamp 8:39. Under the stern gaze of the herders, James became more flustered. He lowered his head, unable to look them in the eye. "My parents live nearby," James said, but his words lacked conviction, only a vague and untruthful feeling. The group began to exchange doubtful glances, but no one spoke, because nothing was adding up. His story was growing more tangled, as if he was trying to buy time, looking for a way out of the tension. "Are you sure the trees aren't bullying you?" One herder, who couldn't take it anymore, teased, smirking, while everyone else looked at James with mocking eyes. "If you say trees can talk, maybe those trees are bothering you." The question wasn't just a taunt. It was a way for the herders to challenge the old man's resolve. James blushed, flustered, and answered, "No. I'm not being bullied. It's just, some trees seem a little upset." His words were even more ridiculous, and in that moment, everyone realized that he was not just lost in the woods, but perhaps also lost in his own words. He couldn't hide the fear in his eyes, and the more he tried to explain the inexplicable, the more confused he became. The herders could only shake their heads, feeling the tension of the situation slowly turning into frustration. They no longer knew what to do with this strange, incomprehensible old man who seemed out of place in this world. Timestamp 9:22. By now, the herders' patience had worn thin. James's words were like a cold splash of water on their last bit of calm. They looked at the old man with eyes full of disappointment, no longer with any sympathy. Whispers and murmurs in the group grew louder. One herder, angry, stepped forward, his gaze like fire, his voice sharp as a knife, cutting through the silence. "We don't care about your tree people. Don't ever step on our land again." His words rang out like a firm, clear warning. Everyone nodded in agreement, their eyes filled with resolve. Another herder, fists clenched, added, "He's done enough. If he dares come back, don't blame us for not holding back." These words were not only a threat, but a firm determination to protect the peace of their farm, not allowing anyone or anything to cause harm. The atmosphere around them grew heavy. The herders no longer saw any humor or ambiguity in James's story. Only frustration and anger remained. They had worked so hard over the years to maintain their farm, protect their cattle, and now a bizarre old man had come to threaten their safety with strange tales about tree people. This was unacceptable. The group fell silent, exchanging cold, resolute glances. A clear end had been decided. James, at that moment, stood motionless, his hands trembling, not daring to resist. The old man looked down at the ground, unable to say anything more, but his face clearly showed failure and confusion. Timestamp 12 o'clock. When things had settled, the tense atmosphere gradually gave way to silence. The group sat down around an old wooden table, where the herders began to make plans to report the incident. People started sweating, sensing that the tension still lingered in the air. One herder sighed softly, his gaze distant, as if thinking about the events that had just unfolded. He picked up a pen, but seemed unable to focus. "We need to protect our rights, not let people like him cause chaos again," he said wearily, his voice heavy with the burdens he carried. Each of his words rang out as a declaration, a warning for themselves and anyone who might plot to invade the peace of their farm. The group of herders sat in silence, no one speaking more, but each of them had a rising resolve. They knew what they had to do to protect their work, their land, and the animals they loved. Everything was over, but it wasn't just a simple event. It was a warning, a lesson about protection and perseverance. Though the situation had ended, they knew that their lives would continue to face new challenges. Their eyes looked ahead, full of vigilance, but also filled with self-confidence. They couldn't let strange things, bizarre stories, or mysterious individuals shake the foundation they had built. To protect their rights, they would not hesitate to stand up, no matter the challenge, and so the story of the old tree man became a legend in the region. Who knows, perhaps the tree people really do exist, but surely no one would want to encounter them in the middle of their farm. 2. Unruly mother in hotel doesn't go away peacefully. Can we get an adult here? A peaceful evening at the Grand Mirage Hotel. Everything seemed to be passing by like any other night. The cheerful laughter of vacationers enjoying their holiday created a warm atmosphere for the hotel. Even Lili, the receptionist, felt that peace as she sat alone at the desk, going through a few documents and preparing for the next shift. However, this tranquility lasted only until the phone at the front desk rang, breaking the silence. "Customer in room 217 refuses to leave," a hurried voice said over the phone. Lili immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation. A drunk and loud woman had refused to leave the room after being warned several times. Lili hurriedly walked outside, preparing to face the awkward situation. She stepped into the elevator with a bit of anxiety, but full of determination. "I'll handle this, nothing to worry about," she reassured herself, trying to stay calm. When Lili arrived at the room, she knocked on the door and asked the woman to leave. However, instead of complying, the woman opened the door with a bleary look and a smug smile on her lips. She slurred, "It's just a little fun, nothing serious." When Lili tried to guide her back to her room, the woman pushed her, as if to assert her freedom in any circumstance. "It's just for fun. Are you my mother or something? Why are you being so serious?" she said, her tone somewhat defiant, as though she didn't realize the gravity of the situation. Lili sighed as she looked into the eyes of two children standing outside the door, tears glistening on their cheeks. They seemed worried and scared, silent and still. Lili knew that these children shouldn't have to endure this chaos. "Look at this. She's throwing a party no one was invited to, and she won't leave," Lili thought to herself. The children might remember this scene forever, though they may never fully understand what was happening around them. Surely, a hotel wasn't the place for a drunken mother to throw unreasonable parties, especially with children forced to witness such scenes. As Lili checked the booking information, she noticed a mismatch in the number of people. One woman, 2 children, and 2 adults. This doesn't add up at all, Lili thought. She was worried not just about the safety of the children, but also about the mother's behavior. This certainly wasn't a harmless little party like she thought, but a dangerous situation that could escalate quickly. Things were getting out of hand, and Lili knew she had no choice but to handle it immediately. Deciding not to hesitate, Lili and her team called the police. "I hope the authorities can resolve this without escalating the situation," Lili thought, her eyes never leaving the door where the mother was arguing. She could hear shouting from inside the room. "This time, I really don't think we can handle this ourselves," Lili thought, anxiety creeping over her. She looked at the children outside, their eyes full of confusion and fear. Would this situation end peacefully? The police arrived and immediately recognized that the situation was not simple. The woman was sitting on the floor, her face blank as if she didn't understand what was happening. When she saw the officers, her hesitant voice, full of confusion, spoke up. "I just came from Dave & Buster's." The words seemed like an unconscious attempt to find a reasonable excuse, a justification for her actions. In reality, what she didn't realize was that her disoriented state only made the situation more serious. She was still drunk, and her chaotic actions made it clear that no matter how hard she tried to justify herself, nothing could hide the obvious truth. Despite her attempts to avoid the police's intervention with meaningless explanations, the police were not easily deterred. They repeated, "You need to leave," in a calm but firm tone. However, the woman still refused to cooperate and even declared, "I'm a great mother." This statement was repeated in a loop, and no matter how many times she said it, it couldn't conceal the fact that her actions were far from those of a responsible mother. Her drunkenness, lack of control, and disregard for others' advice only highlighted the contrast with the image of the mother she wanted to project. With the strong smell of alcohol on her breath and her out-of-control demeanor, it was clear that the woman was no longer capable of driving safely home. Her actions not only endangered herself, but also the children who had to witness the scene. At this point, no one could deny that the situation had exceeded what was acceptable. The police were no longer dealing with just a quarrel, but a dangerous situation that involved not only the mother's rights, but also the safety of the children that needed to be protected. As the argument between the drunken mother and the police continued, the tension in the air began to rise. The woman became increasingly aggressive, shouting and pushing the officers as if she were the one in charge. "I'm not going anywhere!" she screamed into the night, as if challenging them, her tone wild and irrational. The police had to increase their presence and demand that she cooperate, patiently trying to convince her, "We don't want to hurt you, but you need to leave." At this point, everyone's patience was wearing thin. The woman was not only obstructing the police, but also making everything more complicated with her stubborn attitude. Finally, after a long struggle to maintain calm and carry out their duties, the police had no choice but to arrest the woman. As she was escorted outside, her irrational actions continued. She kicked the police car, shouting insults, words only a drunken mother could come up with. "I'm suing you! My children will never forgive you," she continued yelling, even though her actions were not only wrong, but also indefensible. Meanwhile, the two children inside the room looked out through the door crack. They couldn't understand everything that was happening, only seeing their mother being taken away in chaos. The little girl looked at her brother with anxious, confused eyes. "Where is Mommy? Why is she out there?" Her innocent question seemed like a silent cry for help, reflecting the insecurity and fear of children facing a world without their mother's protection. The sense of safety they usually felt when close to her seemed to have vanished. The children could only stand there, holding each other's hands, their eyes filled with tears, not knowing what was going on or how it would end. The children not only had to witness their mother's arrest, but were also left in a quiet and frightening room. They no longer knew who to turn to in this situation. They sat on the floor, hugging each other in the darkness, trying to find some safety in the chaos surrounding them. But deep inside, they knew that the stability they longed for was far from reality. As their mother was driven away in the police car, the children were left behind in eerie silence, unsure of what would happen next in a world where even their mother couldn't set an example. This time, the Grand Mirage Hotel was not just a place for enjoyable holidays, but a witness to a never-ending battle between maturity and responsibility. That night, in a tense situation, the adults failed to demonstrate the calmness or decisiveness expected of them. A drunken mother, defying all rules and reason, had turned the hotel into a battleground between social norms and personal impulsiveness. This was not just a story about one individual losing control, but a reminder that sometimes adults are no different from children in how they handle difficult situations. It was a night that made all those who witnessed it realize that sometimes adults don't always behave like true grown-ups. A mother, despite having the responsibility to nurture and protect her children, could forget her role in tense situations. Instead of being a role model for her children, she got caught up in meaningless arguments and impulsive, even dangerous actions. The mother's immaturity in this situation forced those around her, including the police and hotel staff, to take on responsibilities that she should have handled. But interestingly, while the adults dived into arguments showing impatience and vulnerability, it was the children who were the most admirable. Though they couldn't fully understand what was happening, they stood firm. Despite being scared and confused, the children had no choice but to hold each other in the dark, hoping everything would return to normal. Their anxiety, insecurity, and unconditional love for each other made them the bravest in this situation. When the mother couldn't protect them, the children had to seek safety in a chaotic world, and this was the clearest affirmation of their inner strength. That night, the Grand Mirage Hotel wasn't just a place that witnessed a mother's instability, it highlighted the contrasting ways adults and children face challenges. Adults may have reason and experience, but they don't always show maturity in their actions. On the other hand, the children, though small and lacking life experience, were more resilient in facing fear and crisis than anyone else. They were the brave ones who, even though unable to explain everything, at least knew how to hold each other's hands and face their fears. Third, entitled Woman Turns Traffic Ticket into Felony. On a sunny afternoon in Orange County, Florida, under the peaceful atmosphere of an ordinary day, Officer Smith, the typical traffic cop in his neat uniform, walked up to a parked car. The driver, Jasmine, looked no different than a model, preparing to step onto a red carpet, only this red carpet was filled with anxiety in her eyes. "Do you know that your car's registration has been suspended and your insurance has been revoked?" Officer Smith asked, trying to maintain a calm tone. Jasmine wasn't interested, mumbling something about the rights of a driver, as if she were participating in a beauty contest instead of being pulled over for a traffic violation. To Jasmine, this seemed like a minor injustice. "I just paid the fine yesterday. My license has been reinstated," she boldly declared. However, when Officer Smith checked the system, the harsh truth emerged. Jasmine's license had been suspended 4 times. She wouldn't back down, continuing to argue, "It's just a small mistake. I shouldn't be treated like this." Each word was like a punch to Officer Smith's patience, forcing him to suppress his laughter at the naivety and injustice Jasmine was experiencing. However, this friendly conversation didn't last long. Suddenly, Jasmine opened the car door and stepped out, her gaze fearless, as if she had just won the main character award in the Driver of the Year contest. She lifted her chin, glared at Officer Smith, and declared defiantly, "I have the right to leave. You can't keep me here." Her words hit Officer Smith like a slap, leaving him frozen, unsure of how to respond. "Do you know this isn't a contest to see who can shout the loudest?" he thought, still watching her walk away with confidence. Jasmine had no intention of compromising. As if feeling she was the center of attention, she began stomping her feet, creating a ripple in the air. Officer Smith, though accustomed to such situations, was surprised this time. While he tried to stay calm, Jasmine's voice grew more biting. "What are you doing? I didn't do anything wrong. I have the right to be free." Officer Smith took a deep breath, trying not to get swept up in her impulsive words. He then announced that Jasmine's car would be impounded. "This vehicle will be held, and you need to resolve the licensing issue before you can drive again," he said firmly. Instantly, Jasmine reacted like a ticking time bomb. "You can't do this. I need this car to take care of my kids." She began raising her voice, waving her hands as if presenting an argument in court. "What? Your car needs to take care of your kids?" Officer Smith thought, struggling to remain composed. The argument grew more heated. Jasmine didn't realize that each word she said was only adding fuel to the fire. The fire was not only burning within her, but spreading around, making the atmosphere even more tense. Officer Smith, who was all too familiar with situations like this, silently wondered, "Do your kids need a driver's license too?" When backup arrived, Jasmine still had no intention of stopping. She returned to her car, her eyes cold and determined, like an action movie heroine, ready to drive off despite all the warnings. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, accelerating forcefully, as if just one more push would allow her to escape the police's control. "You're not going anywhere!" Officer Smith shouted, his voice deepening. But Jasmine showed no hesitation. The screech of tires tearing up the pavement was followed by a cloud of dust. "She really intends to run," Officer Smith thought, feeling like he was facing a criminal fleeing the scene in an action movie. The short pursuit began with the sound of sirens piercing the air. Jasmine drove frantically, but with pride, as though she were in a speed race. Officer Smith, though still composed, couldn't help but chuckle inwardly. "This isn't Fast and Furious, ma'am," he thought, smiling wryly, as her car zoomed by. Finally, when Jasmine decided to defy the situation further, opening her car door and stomping her feet as though preparing for a showdown, Officer Smith had no choice but to act. He rushed forward, pulling her out of the car. A brief struggle ensued as Jasmine continued to shout, "I didn't do anything wrong," as if every action she took was completely justified. Each time she resisted, the situation grew more intense. But in reality, her actions only proved her violation. Eventually, with backup assistance, Officer Smith subdued her. She struggled, but could not escape the police's hold. Once restrained, Officer Smith couldn't help but ask, "Did you know that this won't count toward your score in any sport?" The question, dripping with sarcasm, was his way of maintaining composure in the situation. Jasmine, being pushed into the patrol car, continued to complain, "I didn't punch anyone, you're misunderstanding." She panted, her face filled with disappointment, as if she were the victim of an unjust case. "I just want to go home and take care of the kids." Her voice was pleading, but in Officer Smith's eyes, the question rang out, "If you were really taking care of the kids, why are you here?" At the police station, Jasmine was informed of charges for resisting arrest, obstructing traffic, and fleeing the scene. A vacant look flashed in her eyes as she heard the charges, and immediately fear surged. If convicted, she could face up to 5 years in prison. What will happen to my life if I lose my freedom? The question cut deeply into her mind as tears streamed down her face. Officer Smith silently thought, maybe it's time for her to reassess her driving and parenting. However, Jasmine kept calling out about her children and her financial situation, as if these were strong enough reasons to erase any consequences. "I can't leave them alone. I need to be there to take care of them." Her desperate cries echoed in the air, a last-ditch effort to change the reality she had created. But despite the anguish in her voice, no one could change the truth. Officer Smith looked at her with empty eyes, silently thinking, maybe the kids should learn independence sooner. An odd situation unfolded when Jasmine began rummaging through her purse as if searching for something. Officer Smith observed and asked, "What are you looking for?" Jasmine flinched, her face suddenly revealing confusion. Just a few essentials," she stammered, as though 1,000 thoughts were racing through her mind. Officer Smith sighed, realizing that she wasn't just facing serious charges, but was also someone who refused to take responsibility. Eventually, Jasmine was taken into custody, with all her actions recorded on video, which would serve as undeniable evidence in the upcoming trial. Jasmine's story, a woman who took entitlement and acted on her own whims without considering the consequences, became a valuable lesson in the unforeseeable repercussions in life. Who knows, perhaps in the future, Jasmine will become a model for those who drive without a license, but also a cautionary tale for anyone who thinks they can break the law without paying the price.